Hello, good listeners, and welcome to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives, a show about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dyck.
I think it's just over 4 years now that I've been working in the archives. And it started with my lifelong interest in history. I always wanted to know more about history and the past and people's stories. But, you know, that can go so many different ways. How I found the archives was Conrad actually came to my high school once, many years ago, and he did a presentation on what kind of treasures we hold in the archives.
That was an excerpt from my interview with Archives Assistant Sara Dyck from March 2025, sharing how archivist Conrad Stace first got her interested in history and the archives. I'm delighted to welcome Sara back to the show, this time in the host chair. Since Sara and I share the same last name, you might wonder if we are related. I wondered about that too, so I did some searching on Grandma Online, the Mennonite genealogical database. As it turns out, we are related, just not very directly. Assuming the Grandma database is accurate, we are distantly connected via all four of our parents. Those relationships go back some 6 and 7 generations and can be traced as far back as 1722 to surnames like Neufeld, Clausen, Sawatsky, Rempel, Unrau, Niebuhr, and, of course, Dyck. So, without further delay, I hand the microphone over to Sara Dyck, my 6th and 7th cousin. I hope you enjoy her retelling of this week's tale, which we're calling Trapped in Icy Waters.
We had sailed into an ice field with ice all around the ship. That's a quote from Gerhard Rempel, one of several Mennonites who relate their story of being stuck in the icy waters of Lake Superior as they faced possible starvation. For today's chilly tale, you might want to cozy up with a warm quilt and a hot drink. Imagine it's spring 1876. You've left your homeland in Russia with just a few belongings and are traveling to your new home in Manitoba, Canada. The ship carrying you across Lake Superior, one of the world's largest freshwater lakes, has become stranded by ice floes, unable to sail. What do you do? Perhaps you peer over the railing at the horizon, shivering in the cold wind, searching for other ships or looking for the port that's supposed to be nearby. Day after day, you hope and pray for rescue. As time passes, hunger sets in. Elias Eby recorded his version of this story in his diary. Aaron Shantz and Peter and Maria Penner, a couple in their 30s, told their versions in letters. At the age of 94, Gerhard Rempel recounted his experience on the ship when he was 11 years old. Klaus Peters, age 20, wrote about the icy ordeal in his book about the Bergtal colony immigrants' journeys to Canada. Put together, their stories describe a journey fraught with danger, worry, risk-taking, courage, and hope. Beginning in 1874, thousands of Mennonites living in South Imperial Russia emigrated. Canada guaranteed them the rights they believed they'd lost in Imperial Russia. Klaus Peters tells us that over the course of 3 summers, emigrating Mennonites almost emptied the villages of the Bergtal colony. After 7 weeks of travel, which he called a long, uninterrupted battle with the wild and heaving sea, they reached Canada. At that time, the Canadian Pacific Railroad did not yet connect Western Canada with Eastern Canada. To get to Manitoba, travelers had to sail across the Great Lakes from Sarnia, Ontario, to Duluth, Minnesota. When spring arrived in 1876, some 442 people boarded a train to Sarnia, where almost 200 bought tickets on the steamship Ontario. The group's guide, Aaron Shantz, also intended to move to Manitoba. He wrote that on May 9th, the ship set out on Lake Huron for what they expected to be a 5-day journey to Duluth. Soon they encountered drifting lake ice, which made what he called a peculiar noise, but the ship made progress. When they reached Lake Superior, crew and passengers encountered much thicker ice floes. The captain applied full steam power to keep the ship moving, but one evening, just 20 miles short of reaching Duluth, they became stranded. Jagged ice floes surrounded the ship and stretched to the horizon. The next morning, the crew measured the thickness of the ice at 15 feet. For days, the Ontario was stuck. The captain tried to free the ship with bursts of power from the steam engine. The ship vibrated strongly, but remained firmly trapped. Provisions, meant to last for a journey of only 5 days, began to run out. By the 10th day, starvation threatened many passengers and crew, wrote Peters. Rempel's view was even more desperate. He declared that we had no food. It was very dangerous. We were facing death. Some Mennonites had brought extra provisions, presumably to help them get started upon arrival in Manitoba. Some had sacks of potatoes, a barrel of flour, cured meats, lard, apples, and probably roasted buns. People bought food from those who had supplies. The ship's cook prepared what was available, and they divided it among themselves. As provisions dwindled, portions became smaller. Peters recounted that the crew and the French and English passengers were much worse off. They had nothing to eat. One day, the captain demanded that we give food to any passengers who asked for it. The situation grew increasingly desperate. Children were crying in every corner, begging for bread. By day 14, the last scrap of food was gone. The ship had only enough coal for 2 more days. If a wind arose and they had no fuel to power the engine, the ship would be dashed to pieces on the next rock. They decided to send for help. Crossing the sharp ice floes on foot would be a dangerous and daring venture, yet 4 crew members volunteered. One of the captains and 3 crewmen tied themselves together with a long rope, with a few meters separating each man. If one were to slip and disappear between the ice floes, the others could pull him out. Each man also carried a long, narrow board under his right arm as a safety measure. Should a man fall through or between the ice floes, the ends of the board might catch on the ice to keep him from sinking into the icy waters. Peters wrote, "It was a sad sight to see these men step off the ship. It was not taken for granted that these men, weakened by hunger, would reach the shore 15 or 20 miles away. The 4 crewmen were not the only ones who risked their lives in this way. 15 of the French passengers followed them, preferring such a death to dying of starvation." Passengers watched them leave from the deck, hoping and praying. The captain leading the group fell several times, saved by his lifeboard. Rempel later recalled that the ice had edges as sharp as knives. It cut up their footwear, their feet, and their hands. The group had set out across the ice just before noon, agreeing to light a signal fire upon reaching land. Toward evening, one weary messenger returned to the Ontario, too exhausted to say more than, "So weak I would never reach the shore." Around 11 p.m. that same evening, the ship's watchman spotted a glimmer of firelight in the distance. The courageous trekkers had reached the shore. That night, a strong wind arose. It shifted the ice enough that open water appeared. With renewed hope and courage, the passengers were told to gather at the rear of the ship. Their weight sank the propellers deeper into the water. The captain worked the ship forward and backward. The ship shook and vibrated from the effort. The robust propellers shattered the ice and tossed it aside. Suddenly, the ship jolted. A sailor shouted, "The ship is moving!" and all cheered. The captain navigated carefully through patches of open water. After several hours, they reached more passable water. They spotted 2 nearby ships, the Asia and the Manitoba, which had also been stuck in the ice. When the Asia came alongside, its crew rolled a barrel of flour onto the Ontario. Peters wrote that without delay, the ship's cook transformed it into something edible to satisfy the hungry. However, their ordeal was not over. They remained on Lake Superior, surrounded by dense ice floes. For all the effort, the Ontario had moved less than a kilometer. No ship could free itself from this icy torment by itself. The captains of the 3 ships made a plan. They would work together with the Ontario, the strongest ship, at the front, and the other 2 pushing from behind. The collaboration began. Peters writes, "Our Ontario rammed full force into the ice until it was stuck. Then the Asia and Manitoba pushed forward until they could not go any farther. Then the ships were lashed together to retreat until the front ship was free. This attack was repeated again and again. They lurched back and forth relentlessly. The collisions threw passengers to the deck, injuring some. Continuing their united efforts, the three ships reached the port just before sunset. What started out as a 5-day voyage had turned into a life-threatening 15-day ordeal. With indescribable joy, the passengers disembarked and took up lodging in the immigrant house at Duluth. Up first on the agenda was to buy bread. It had never tasted so good. With the families settled into lodgings, the men returned to the dock for their baggage. There they surveyed the ships. Battered and smashed, the sturdy oak bows hung in splinters and shreds. All three ships would need extensive repairs. Later on, the ship's owners were convinced to never again let their ships leave the harbor so early in the year. Peter and Maria Penner traveled with their 3 young children. In a report some decades later, Peter summed up their experience. It was distressful, but better than we feared, since no one died of hunger. We lived on 5 potatoes and a 1/4 pound of bread per day, but the Lord opened the way. None of the accounts we accessed mentioned what happened to the men who left the ship on their rescue mission, but we do know that our storytellers eventually got to their Manitoba destination and moved on with their lives. Aaron Shantz found work in a store shortly after reaching Winnipeg. The Penners settled in the Rosengard area, between Grunthal and Steinbach on the East Reserve. They had 13 children, 6 of whom died in infancy. Some of them later moved to Alberta, Mexico, and Belize. Young Gerhard Rempel and his family settled in Waldheim, on the West Reserve in Manitoba. He went on to marry Helena Wall. They had 8 children and farmed near Roland, Myrtle, and in the rural municipality of Stanley. Klaus Peters, our primary storyteller, first settled in Grunthal on the East Reserve. He farmed, taught school in nearby Bloomstein, ran a bookstore, and then moved to the West Reserve in 1881. He married Katarina Lowen in Gretna, and they had 9 children. The family lived in several places in Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Klaus started businesses and became an immigration agent, guiding delegates and settling Mennonite families in Saskatchewan and Oregon. He traveled to Russia several times and to Kansas, Nebraska, Mexico, and South America for his work. He became a somewhat controversial figure among Mennonites. In 1897, he left the Mennonite Church and joined the Swedenborgians, a community some describe as a church and others as a cult. Yet he continued to act as a Mennonite minister, signing military exemption cards for eligible Mennonite young men during World War I. He built a hotel and saloon. Klaus and Katarina moved to Florida in 1921, but in 1925 they returned to Saskatchewan. Mennonite historian Leonard Dole has written a biography of Klaus Peters. You can learn more about Peters at the Mennonite Heritage Archives. To see images related to this story or learn more about it, visit mharchives.ca. We're always happy to receive any comments and questions about this program. Contact us by email at info@mharchives.ca.
Hello, I'm Archivist Conrad Stace. The Mennonite Heritage Archives is a community-supported memory center that relies on donations from community members like you. To support this program and the preservation of Mennonite history, visit mharchives.ca and click on Support, or give us a call at 204-560-1998. Thanks also to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Mennonite Church Canada, and Golden West Radio.
In an upcoming episode, we'll bring you a conversation with Maria Lotzmanova, who previously worked at Moscow's Gulag History Museum and learned about her great-grandfather, Jacob Petrovich Jansen, who was exiled in early Soviet times. Today's Trapped in Icy Waters story was researched and written by Helene Workington and adapted for radio by Dan Dyck. Thanks also to the Tales support team of Conrad Stace and David Klippenstein. I'm your host, Sara Dyck, sitting in today for Dan Dyck. Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will be back next week with more stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. Thanks for listening.